Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and align them to biblical truth. I always say I'm excited to have a guest on because usually I have some sort of, I always have knowledge of who they are, or I've read their books or something to that effect. But my guest today is Katy Faust, and she has written a book called Them Before Us. And this book fascinates me. And I know I kind of give a lot of recommendations of different books on the podcast, but I only recommend what I read, one, and I only recommend two, what I think will help you in either your apologetic studies or, theology, or in cultural issues that we need to have knowledge and awareness of, so that way we can better understand and live within the culture that God has placed us in. So today, my guest is Katy Faust. She is the founder and director of Them Before Us. She received her undergraduate degree in political science and Asian studies at St. Olaf College, and then received a Fulbright scholarship to Taiwan. Hey, Fulbright, that's my last name. Her fluency in Mandarin assisted her when she worked with the largest Chinese adoption agency in the world. She publishes widely on the rights of children and is a regular contributor at The Federalist. Katy is the Washington state leader for the grassroots marriage movement, Katy Faust. Did I say that right, Katy?
You nailed it, Katy Faust.
All right. Sometimes you just never know. And currently appears in their video series, Dear Katy. She is married to a pastor and the mother of 4 children, the youngest of whom is adopted from China. Katy, thank you, because I know you're busy. We talked about this. You were in South Dakota last week, and you travel often and talk about children's rights. So I just want to say first, thank you for being here and taking the time to talk with me.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me the chance to share with your audience. This is something that not a lot of people think about, but especially Christians, I believe, need to be experts on the topic because it really does have to do with defending the most vulnerable among us.
Absolutely. And that's why I believe your book intrigues me. There are books that I gravitate towards because they're teaching me, they're giving me this intellectual knowledge. Yours challenges us with things that I agree with, but never knew the depth of data behind. And we're going to talk about that because I have a really hard time, and you know this because I've been talking to you. I'm having a hard time not getting ahead of myself because there's so much I want to just she's here, I want to talk to her. And I have all of these questions because your book literally fascinates me. It will keep people peeled to the pages and, just their eyes stuck within them. And I can't recommend it enough. So that's what we're going to talk about. And then we'll let everyone know how they can get it. So you wrote this book, Them Before Us, and the subtitle is Why We Need a Global Children's Rights Movement. So what inspired you to write on children's rights?
Yeah, well, so the origin story is kind of, I am not an activist by nature, and I didn't necessarily want to get into really controversial topics because I like to keep my friends. I'm actually a lot more, I err on the side of the grace giver side of the grace teller, truth teller spectrum. I would rather just be quiet and keep the peace. But it was during the marriage debate when I heard people seeking to redefine marriage using a rationale that kids don't need moms and dads, right? That kids with 2 moms or 2 dads fare just as well. And they don't care if they don't have a mom or dad. And, my husband and I have worked with kids for decades, either in youth ministry or, me in the adoption world, or just being a child and watching the fallout of family breakdown and fathers especially leaving the family. And there was no bigger lie that I could see based on all of that experience, that kids don't care if they've lost their mom or dad. What I've actually seen is it's one of the greatest wounds that is inflicted upon children is when they are denied a relationship with their mom or dad for whatever reason, death, divorce, abandonment, even if they're subsequently adopted. The children that I've worked with through adoption, even though they're often adopted by incredible moms and dads, most of them are at minimum curious. And then especially later in life, sometimes have this freight train of a drive to figure out who are these 2 people responsible for my existence. So this idea that you can just cut and paste children into any and every emotional configuration really just means that kids lose. And like I said, generally I'm non-confrontational and very nice, but there's something about me that when adults say, no, kid, you sacrifice for me, Suddenly my sweet pastor's wife disposition just says, get behind me, Satan. It's on. It's on, right? So I started writing about children's rights as it relates to marriage and family through the marriage debate. But what I quickly discovered is that not just in the marriage debate, but every other issue about marriage and family, every single issue about marriage and family, the adult's desires are always elevated to the highest goal and the highest good. Children's needs, desires, and rights are always the sacrifice on the altar of adult desire. It's always the kids who have to pay the price. They never get a voice in all of this. So we started Them Before Us, the nonprofit that now is a global movement. Like, I'm about to sign my 4th contract for the book being translated into another language in less than a year of it being published. Like, everywhere this message goes, it just lights a fire. So we began this movement of looking at every marriage and family issue, from the definition of marriage to divorce to cohabitation to rising acceptance of polygamy and polyamory to same-sex parenting, reproductive technologies like sperm, egg donation, surrogacy, and even adoption, looking at every marriage and family issue from the perspective of the child first. And the reason why it is a bit of a viral idea is because it's a very simple template that you can lay over the top of any question about marriage and family, children's rights to their mom and dad, and come out with the correct answer, whether it's the correct policy answer when you're talking about a case in a courtroom before the Supreme Court, or whether you're talking about a personal matter in terms of, our marriage is struggling and we're dealing with communication issues. What should we do? So this children's rights approach offers incredible clarity for policymakers and the public in general.
Yes. And first of all, I appreciate you saying what many of us feel like. I'd rather keep my friends and live this quiet life and not be controversial. And at the beginning of your book, you talked about writing, I believe it was blog posts, and then you started getting pushback on that. What I like about this whole thing is that you didn't stop. You could have stopped at the blog posts and, okay, the people are being mean and they're coming at me and whatever. But now you kept going, and look at what you've done. I mean, as you're talking about all the things that are in this book, I was looking through and I'm like, yep, she's right. Because I remember, even as I've been reading it and highlighting it, it's such a well-rounded information that brings it constantly back to, here's a scenario for you where the kids may not have a biological mother and father. Here's why it's not good. And some of it, when I reached out to you a couple months ago saying, would you like to be on my podcast? You said, read the book, make sure it's something that you know what I'm going to be expect me to say, and everything you've said in it. I'm telling you, it's fascinating. And so
that's by design. And let me just be clear, that is by God's design. Okay. So
yeah,
God designed this. And if your audience is generally Christian, you totally understand the biblical support for the idea that men and women commit to one another before they make babies, right? That's
yes.
Jesus affirmed it in his definition of marriage. It's a very gendered definition of marriage. And I am like as Bible thumper as you get. Like, I carry my Bible around in my purse wherever I go. Whenever I'm carpooling, I hand my Bible back to whatever kid's in the car, and I'm like, hey, read me some scripture. I don't care what it is. We're going to discuss it. Like, I'm Bible nuts. But
right.
You won't find scripture in this book. Okay.
No, right.
Because what we are doing is, all of us Christians understand God's design from the perspective of revelation, right? But our fellow citizens, they don't share that scriptural authority. Their authority is natural law. Their authority is the natural world. And so that's what we do in the book, is we present this perspective from a common authority that is research, statistics, human nature, and the stories of kids themselves who have had to live through these modern families. And what happens when you tackle that from a natural law perspective, beginning with the rights of the child, is it's going to make demands on every adult. It is going to make demands on single adults, married adults, gay adults, and straight adults. And so I have told everybody, I actually said this at a Heritage Foundation panel one time. I said, give me enough time and I'll piss you off too. Like, there is no adult group that gets a pass when you are talking about respecting the fundamental rights of children. It is going to make demands of all of us. And there are some platforms that would love to talk about same-sex parenting and why that infringes on the rights of children and how bad it is for kids to grow up in a same-sex headed household. But they're not really interested in talking about the impact of no-fault divorce. Or
Right.
really don't think it's a big deal if sweet Christian heterosexual couples are using sperm donors because, love makes a family in those cases, doesn't it? So what we do is we say, no, we are going to begin with the rights of the child. Children have these rights. We are in this place where we are for every adult that is doing hard things on behalf of children, but we will oppose any adult and any idea that insists that children do hard things for adults.
Yes. So speaking of that, now I actually told my dad this around New Year's, that you had explained what a right is. And I want you to explain that to us. And this literally blew me away because, see, we live in culture and you're right. We read the Bible and we can be like, hey, we got to keep everything up to the standard of scripture, which we do. And there's no argument there. But we can easily kind of become unaware of actually what's taking place and why these things are so foundationally and fundamentally important with a child having a biological mother and father. And you started with explaining what rights are. And we hear in culture all the time that everyone has a right to this and a right to that and a right to love and a right to housing and a right, all these rights. But when you explained it, it was like, and my dad actually said, when I told him what you had said in your book, he's like, how do people come up with this stuff? Like, how do they know? And I said, yeah, you know what it is? It's common sense, but we never really hear it. We're not even talking about it in the church. So with that being said, the lead into this big question is, will you explain the 3 rules that make it a right, like a right test for us?
Yeah. So this is, let me just say, I am surrounded by natural lawyers, like people who have like PhDs in rights and natural rights and constitutional rights. And it is a huge field. Like I am a novice when it comes to it. And there are conflicting ideas about what rights are. And you just mentioned some of them, right? A lot of us believe that there are very limited rights that are enumerated in the Constitution given by God. And then other people on the other side of things will say, no, anything that I really, really want, that's a right and I have a right to it. So as lay people, trying to make sense of all of this and distilling what we actually know based on natural law philosophy. Okay, we didn't solve the whole problem, but Stacy and I, my co-author, kind of distilled what it is that if it meets this criteria, you know that it's a natural right. Okay, and then we make the case for natural rights being recognized as legal rights. This is exactly what Martin Luther King Jr. did, is he began with natural rights and he said, if our legal system does not acknowledge natural rights, an injustice has been done. Okay, that is why the pro-life movement has been fighting so long for children's natural right to life to be reflected in our laws as well, because injustice is done when natural rights are not protected. So from our very novice lens, Stacy and I sort of discerned, here's the 3 things that tend to make something a definitive, inarguable right. So the first one is a natural right is pre-government. So if it existed before government, you know that it's a right. So for example, your right to life, the first thing that's listed in the Constitution, right, is life, then liberty, then the pursuit of happiness/equality. And so life existed pre-government, and the government is here to recognize and protect the right. It doesn't give you life. It existed pre-government. The second one is nobody has to provide you with a natural right. It's something that you inherently have, right? Like the ability to speak, the ability to worship. Okay. You don't go to the store and have it shipped to you.
Right.
And then finally, we say a natural right is equally distributed. If it can vary in degree or in kind, then it's not a natural right. So a dorm room versus Mar-a-Lago, right? If it can vary in its distribution, it's not a natural right. So when you look at children's right to life and children's right to their own mother and father, you see that both of these absolutely pass the 3 rules that make it a right test with flying colors, right? A natural right is pre-government. So our life existed before government, our connection to our parents existed before government. No one has to provide a natural right. We automatically have life if we are here. And if we are here, our parents are also here. The two people who created us also exist. And a natural right is equally distributed. So each of us have exactly one life. And each of us, regardless of our family structure, have exactly two parents, one mother and one father. And so you can make arguments for other rights, and there might be other rights out there. But if it doesn't at least pass these three fundamentals, you're not talking about a right. You're probably talking about a commodity, maybe a commodity that people need to live, but that's not a right.
Yes. And that's why after reading your book, when you're tying this into every child has a right to their own mother and father, their biological mother and father, it's like it stuck together. It came together because never have I thought of it that way, unfortunately, and never have I heard of it that way until I read your book. And that's why I'm saying this book, it sucks you in, and then you just start highlighting everything, because as a Christian, you see where it makes sense, and you see where we also need to be more aware of vulnerable children that are suffering in this world, because we are not taking these things into consideration. We're not looking at them this way. And it's again, it blows me away, because I love that you put it into 3 rules that make it a right, Tess, because I can do that. I can be like, oh, okay. So from now on, if I hear somebody saying it's my right for this or that, I'll be like, wait a second, let me get out the 3 rules.
Yeah.
Is this really a right? And it's genius to me. It's just genius. So again, there's so many things in the book that I didn't know. Okay. So in the 80s, I'm a kid and I don't know what's going on with divorce and marriage, because I could care less. I'm like, I think 5. So you had mentioned in the whole, I believe it's chapter 6 on divorce, that there was no fault divorce was instituted by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, making it easier to have a divorce. And once I learned that, you can see the trajectory of marriage from that point to this point, where it's like, oh my gosh, it's just like a downhill sled, just going at this rate of speed, where marriage is on the decline for one. Divorces have been, I think it's like around 50% or something like that. But can you explain the outcome of this law on marriages in the United States, and why staying together is better for kids than getting a divorce? Because I always hear, it's not good for us to fight around the kids. It's not good for them to have this sort of, this family structure in the home where mom and dad aren't getting along. Why do you say suck it up and get over it and stay together for your kids?
Yeah, good. So many good things in that, and we're going to talk about everything. One thing I do want to say before we go to divorce is, let's you and I spend a little time talking about biology and the importance of the biological connection between parent and child. And then let's answer what I know the alarm bells are going off in so many of your listeners going, what about adoption? What about adoption? So that's always a huge question, especially with Christian audiences. And so for those of you out there who are like, wait a second, we're going to get to that, okay? But let's talk about divorce, because the Christian and the conservative world were completely up in arms when it got to the redefinition of marriage, where we started to look at legislating and approving gay marriage. But that was not the original redefinition of marriage. The original redefinition of marriage was the passage of no-fault divorce, first in California in 1969, and then pretty much it swept the country, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what divorce was before no-fault divorce. It used to be that you could get a divorce if one party was deemed at fault. They were at fault for breaking the marital vows through adultery or abandonment or addiction or abuse. And in those cases, the court and generally the rest of society would side with the innocent spouse, right? The wife that was battered would get custody and the house, and the guy would have to stay away. Or the woman who ran off with her boss, she would not necessarily be looked upon favorably in court proceedings. And so what at-fault divorce did is it rewarded the faithful spouse, the one that was doing their best to live up to the marital vows. And often it protected the children by putting them in the home of the adult that was acting the most responsibly. So when no-fault divorce was passed, in essence, what it did, so marriage used to be this complementary vehicle, right, where it involved man and woman. And it used to have a presumption of exclusivity. It was just the two of them. Nobody else was going to be involved. And there was an expectation of permanence, that it was going to last forever. And all of those have a very child-specific benefit to them. Complementarity, because men and women offer distinct and complementary benefits to children. Exclusivity, because if there's more than just those two adults in the home, children's outcomes tend to plummet. And without permanence, the kid has no guarantee that they're going to have their mom and their dad every day for the rest of their life, right? So the first marriage redefinition was when we removed the expectation of permanence from marriage through no-fault divorce. Now, that has had a devastating effect on kids. It's very hard to understate the damage that divorce has done to individual children and, as a result, all of society. So an easier way to think about this is we talk about the three staples of a child's social emotional diet. Kids need lots of different things when they're growing, but if they do not have these three things, they are going to be emotionally malnourished. So those three things are mother's love, father's love, and stability. So even in the very best case, right, the amicable divorce where mom and dad still get along and there's no major custody battles, even in the best case scenario, kids will always be starved of 50% of dad's love and 50% of mom's love. But what often happens afterwards, I mean, almost universally, is instability. Not only is the child shuffling between households once a week or twice a week or more, but oftentimes both mom and dad, or either mom or dad, will be like, hey, look, I'm back to my dating years. And then the child will go through extreme cycles in one or both of their households of new partners or new spouses, new stepchildren or new half-siblings. And because secondary and tertiary divorces are more likely to break up, they usually experience several new partnerings and several breakups. Add that to different moves, one or both parents moving out of state or moving to another house or dropping out of the child's life completely. And what you have is instability, which characterizes a child's life post-divorce. We detail in the book that divorce impacts a child physically, right? These children of divorce are more likely to get certain kinds of cancers, suffer all kinds of chronic illnesses. They're even more likely to have more colds than other children who grew up in intact families. They suffer incredible emotional damages. They suffer academically. Their grades always take a hit. And they suffer relationally. These children are far less likely to be able to form and maintain their own stable relationships as they grow. So the first thing we do in this chapter is we say, divorce is going to be an incredible hardship on your child, even sometimes if it's justified, even if there is a justifiable reason for divorce. Don't pretend like it doesn't cost the kid anything. But once you look at the incredible cost to kids, then the answer is, look, if you are in a struggling marriage, which can I just say, in my life when I'm not lobbying in the capital of South Dakota on behalf of children's rights, I'm a pastor's wife, and on Thursday, I was meeting with state reps, and on Saturday, I was doing marriage counseling in my husband's office with a couple that's dealing with the challenges that most of us deal with at some point in our marriage. You have to fix it. You, the adult, have to fix it. I mean, unless there's extreme cases of abuse, in which case, safety first, right? But no, this is a permanent relationship for a reason. And if you, the adults, cannot work out and these are big issues, right? I'm not minimizing the challenges of marriage. I'm not minimizing the damage of emotional or physical affairs or porn use or communication problems or dealing with somebody's childhood trauma that is affecting the marriage or whatever it is. These are big issues. But if you cannot work it out, I will tell you what you're doing. What you're saying is, this cross is too heavy for us. Here, kids, you take it instead. You are simply making the kids do the hard work that you or your spouse refuse to do. Someone is going to do the hard thing. Is it going to be the adults or is it going to be the children?
Wow. That's heavy, but it's good.
It's hard needed. Message. I mean, and that's what I mean. This is a hard message. Plenty of people are happy to talk about why single or double men shouldn't be creating motherless children through surrogacy. There's not a lot of platforms that are enthusiastic about hearing why you need to stick it out in your marriage, even though.
But it's needed though.
Right.
And the reason why there aren't a lot of platforms is because people, well, let's just take it back to the church. The church has just, I think sometimes we wave that white flag of surrender and it becomes a cultural norm within the church, and we don't talk about it. But if we are Christians and we hold to biblical truth, we cannot kick this one out the window.
Right.
You know, our society already is, this whole argument of gender fluidity and there's no difference between male and female is crippling, is going to have huge, huge effects on society. We may not see them exactly at the moment, which I do believe we are seeing them. I believe that kids are already suffering. They have identity issues that I have never had to deal with when I was their age. And so, yeah, I believe, and I think you're right. It has to do with the mother and the father and the structure of marriage and the family unit. And that's why I said I appreciate what you say, because you say the hard things. And you know, I don't know if even me saying this to you, Katy, even me saying this over this podcast, like, I don't know if you understand how much I appreciate it. I don't know if I hope that the listener understands how needed this message is, because it's not going to be popular. Culture wants to, we are in a love yourself, you know, culture where we have to get rid of the people that are toxic to us, the people who aren't letting us live our best life. And that's the message we hear. And if that means getting a divorce because you just want to be happy, then that's also applied in this situation.
Yeah. And, you know,
yeah.
we've got an added benefit. A lot of the audiences that I talk to are not Christian. A lot of the context of my work does not also recognize the ultimate authority of Scripture. But since your audience does, let me just point to why I think this may be resonating with you so much. And that is because if you spend any amount of time interacting with Scripture, you understand that God puts a premium on children, protecting them, nourishing them, guiding them into wisdom, ensuring that they are not harmed. And that is the whole, if you look at God's design for sex and marriage, what you see is it is the best chance that kids have for a successful, healthy, safe, and thriving life. And if you compromise on God's design for sex and marriage in any way, in essence, what you're saying is, I'm okay with kids suffering because that is the natural result. You know, we were just talking about divorce, and that, you know, most people, if they know a passage about divorce, it's the God hates divorce passage from Malachi. God was rebuking the elite class who was divorcing their wives when they got to be a little too old and gained a little too much weight, and in essence marrying trophy wives. And he follows up and says, look, I brought the two together. I made them one flesh. And then he tells you why. And he says, in spirit and one they are his. Why? Because God is seeking godly offspring. Right? Why is it that he brings them together in one flesh? Because he wants not just offspring, he wants godly offspring. And when you are raising children outside of the home, like if dad takes off, I mean, especially we see this in Christian homes, if a Christian marriage breaks up, right, and dad takes off or mom takes off, very often kids lose their faith. It's very hard for kids to hold on to their faith in God when the object lesson that God has placed in their lives to represent Christ's devotion to the church is destroyed. It's hard for them to understand God's devotion to them. So this is where the Christian audience says, okay, wait, so you're saying that my kid who doesn't have a dad in his life is absolutely wrecked. And I'm going to say, of course not. But you and your kid know that it's hard. And God can step into the gap no matter what. But these toxic ideas that the kids will be happy if the adults are happy, or that love makes a family, and conforming to these fundamental child needs is irrelevant, those bad ideas have victims, and the victims are children. So we first have to understand like the goodness of God's design as reflected in the natural law design that we spend so much time talking about in our book. But there is something in every Christian that should just the fireworks should be going off when it comes to children. And I think we're already seeing that on a lot of different topics when we're looking at how the gender ideology is harming children's bodies by telling them that they need to become lifelong consumers of pharmaceuticals and cosmetic surgery to transition to a different sex, right? Something about that goes, wait a second, don't touch the kids. But that also needs to be true when it comes to their families.
Yes.
And that sense of, oh my gosh, this is so important, is sparked in you because every Christian can and should be fundamentally concerned with the welfare of children above all else, at least in this created world.
Absolutely. And I do believe the reason why we've gotten to the point where we can say, hey, if you feel like a boy trapped in a girl's body, it's okay. We'll go ahead and give you this, conversion therapy or whatever. When people are like, wait, red flags, we didn't stop people when there was no fault divorce. We didn't stop them. The church hasn't been standing up for children's rights. Like you said, we haven't been, maybe they're like me when you've applied the right to a biological mother and father to the whole rights issue, maybe they're like, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way before. But and maybe that's why we've gotten this far. But the reason we've come this far is because we've let too much go to begin with.
Yes.
We need to be standing up.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly right. I just am working with a family organization in Albania. They are considering adjusting their family code. Now, they do not have an orphan crisis in Albania. Generally, it's a highly religious population, Muslim majority country, and so they err on the side of intact homes. So they don't have a huge foster child population like the United States or an orphan crisis like some other countries. But there are attempts to change their family code to say that it's a right for singles or a right for cohabiting adults to adopt. And that is the place to draw the hard line, right? The hard line is no. Adoption is not a way for adults to get kids, right? That's not what adoption is. Adoption is a just society's response to children who have lost their parents. And whenever possible, children need to be raised by a married mom and dad, especially kids who have suffered the trauma and the loss of of being disconnected from their first family. And so that's right. Like, I'm proud of this Albanian organization for saying, wait a second, no, we don't want to start this slide, right? But we didn't do that in this country. We kind of, turned a blind eye to no-fault divorce. Our churches today very seldom speak against cohabiting couples, which these days are about to outnumber, married millennials. So we are going to have to take on the subjects. There's some churches that are happy to rail against the gays, right? Or whatever. But are we going to focus on every issue where children's rights are being threatened? And the answer for a lot of Christians and even a lot of conservatives is no. We're only going to hammer the populations that serve our political bias or whatever it is.
Right. Well, one of the things that you had mentioned, but I really want to hone in on within this book is I love data, and you didn't disappoint. You gave lots of data on this. This is not your opinion. This is not an opinion book. This is a book that, like you said, provides interviews of kids raised without a mother or a father, or maybe even both of their biological parents. And so there's things in here about, like you said, sperm donors, but that natural desire to want to know who it is that you're tied to biologically, who am I related to? And it's fascinating to see the data lined up with the actual stories of people who have lived this. So again, that's one of the things I appreciate about the book. And like you said, I'm already over halfway through this. I haven't seen one scripture in here. And a lot of times with apologetics, knowing your audience, that's how you approach. You got to come on neutral ground because we don't share the same authority, like you said. And so I feel like it's great for the knowledge that we need as Christians, because people can't deny the facts. I mean, they can if they want to deny truth completely,
right.
But when it's staring you in the face, it's really hard to do. And so speaking of giving those experiences of situations without a mom and a dad and giving all that data, it leads me into the question is, why is it that you say children need both a mother and a father. And I believe that you can correct me if I'm wrong, Katy, but you're saying that they need their biological mother and father when at all possible, right?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
So let's just talk about biology, because this is probably the greatest stumbling block for audiences on both sides. It's definitely a stumbling block for my friends on the left who are so deeply invested in the modern family narrative. And if biology matters, that wrecks their modern family narrative. But it's also a stumbling block for my friends on the right, many of whom are adoptive parents like me, and who understand that adoption is redemptive. And many feel threatened. How dare you say that I'm not enough, or I'm not the real parent to my child, or whatever it is, right? So let's spend some time talking about why biology matters, because it does. So we talk about it we spend an entire chapter on this. Chapter 2 is all about biology and the research we have on biology and why biology matters and what it is that biological parents do for children that no other adults can do. And so you don't need to be threatened by this, okay, is the bottom line. So The reason why it matters, number one, is safety. We have studied family structure for decades, and it is a non-negotiable. Scholars on the left and the right agree that the safest home for a child, the home that maximizes child outcomes, is the home of their married biological mother and father. So when you get experts on the left and right to agree, that's really something. Now, the reason why they say that the biological parents are at the greatest benefit is because there really are natural systems in place that bond children to their own mother and father and vice versa. You especially see that in the maternal-child bond, right? We spend the first 9.5 months bonding to only one person, and that is our mother. And then that bond should continue after birth. And so what we see when we look at the data is that biological parents are statistically the safest adults in a child's life. Now, there are abusive biological parents, and I want to do violence to them. I don't know how else to, if you cannot protect your children, you do not deserve those children. And so those adults, they exist and they need to be condemned. But statistically, those are the safest adults in a child's life. Okay. And whenever you step outside of that married biological mother and father household, all you see is the risks of child abuse and neglect tick exponentially upward. Okay, now, I am not saying that unrelated adults are always abusive or always neglectful. They are not. You and I both know heroic step-parents. We know step-parents who have stepped into the gap of a negligent biological parent, and those adults deserve to be recognized and validated.
Right.
But statistically, the addition of an unrelated adult does not add anything to a child's household. Statistically, children with stepfathers or stepmothers fare about as well as children with single mothers, which is to say, not as well as kids raised by their married biological parents. And if you want to go to unfortunate extremes, the presence of an unrelated adult, especially an unrelated man in a child's household, is the greatest predictor of child abuse.
I saw that.
If you want to fact check me in real time, you can Google the words mother's boyfriend and tell me what you see. You can pause this podcast, Google it, and come back. And what you just saw is pages and pages of the most graphic and horrific child abuse and filicide, that is child homicide, that you'll see anywhere. That a cohabiting unrelated man is statistically the most dangerous person in a child's life. And so a lot of people will say, well, Katy, kids don't need biological parents. They just need to be safe and loved. And I'll say, well, congratulations, you're one of us. Because if you want to ensure that the maximum number of children are safe and loved, then you are going to say children have a right to their biological parents and should be raised by them whenever possible. So in addition to, to further my case on why biological parents are the safest, adoptive parents like me rightly need to go through months of screening and vetting and background checks, references, home studies, post-placement support, supervision, all of that, because social workers are not fools. they understand that it takes more than adults saying, hey, I want to parent this child. I promise I'm going to love them, before they're going to place a child in their home. They are not fools. They understand the risk of placing children with unrelated adults. And that is why we have volumes of adoption best practice on how to vet and screen prospective parents, because these are biological realities that, no matter how much the modern family narrative takes hold, cannot be ignored by people that are genuinely responsible for child welfare. So the second reason why biology matters is because biological parents give something to children that no other adults can give them, something that they desperately want, and that is biological identity. So you can have very loving, caring adoptive parents, or very loving and caring social parents who created children through sperm or egg donation. And maybe the child has more, for adoptive parents, they tend to be more educated, they tend to be more wealthy, and they even statistically spend more time with children than the general population does, right? So adoptive parents, because they've gone through this massive screening, tends to be pretty well positioned to offer safety, love, and connection to their kids. And yet, adopted children struggle more than kids raised by their biological parents, as do children of sperm and egg donation. And much of that has to do with the fact that there is identity struggles that go along with being separated from your biological parents. Many of us know adopted children who, especially when they become adults, desperately want to know the identity of their biological parents. One of the reasons why adoption has shifted so drastically away from closed adoptions, which used to be the norm, to now 95% of adoptions being open adoptions, is because social workers recognize that children benefit from as many connections to their biological family as possible, even if they can't be raised by them. So I don't know if you've noticed, but our whole society is obsessed with who am I? What is my identity? And children raised apart from their biological parent have to answer that question, absent a lot of the kinship bonds that most of humanity has used to answer that question. So biology does matter in the parent-child relationship. It matters in terms of their safety. It matters in terms of the investment and the connection. And it matters in terms of their biological identity. Now, we spend all of chapter 9 contrasting adoption and reproductive technologies and talking about why, even though adoption involves a child growing up without their parents, how adoption is an institution centered around the well-being of children. And reproductive technologies, in contrast, are a marketplace that are centered around the desires of adults. So adoption is a just society's attempt to mend the wound of losing your parents. Reproductive technologies, in essence, inflicts a wound on a child, inflicting and intentionally separating them from their biological parents. And interestingly, that has distinct psychological impacts on the child, to the point where we can see that adopted children who grow up without either biological parent fare better than children created through sperm donation who are raised by their biological mother and unrelated father. So there's something about this intentional inflicting of a wound on children that seems to be especially detrimental to their emotional health.
Wow. That is fascinating, because we never hear these things. I'm telling you guys, you got to get this book, take your notes and read it. And that's the thing I was going to ask you. And I don't even think I need to apply it to any specific parenting, like same-sex marriage or step parents, or, so on and so forth. Because I was going to ask, what is the consequence of like same-sex parenting in the lives of children? But wouldn't that be pretty much the same consequences, whether or not they had same-sex parents, whether or not they had step parents, whether or not they have adoptive parents? Are they going to have, maybe there's going to be a little bit different outcome in the consequence area, but they're all going to have those struggles either way, just because they're not with their biological mother and father, or one of each, right?
Yeah, we spend all of chapter 6 talking about same-sex parenting. And the first half of the chapter is, in essence, completely taking down all of these supposed studies that show that there's no difference between kids raised by same-sex parents and kids raised by opposite-sex parents. It's just junk science.
Now, can I ask you a question about that then?
Absolutely.
With that data? So with that data, who is who's supposedly doing the research and providing this data? And are they just fudging those numbers because of an agenda, or how are they interpreting the data are they just interpreting it to go their way and manipulating that data? How do you know that answer?
Yes, I know the answer. And we spent quite a bit of time discussing what the methods of the studies were. In general, the quickest summary is bias, right? These researchers had a bias. And so they set up these quote unquote studies to confirm their bias, usually by using very small samples, not using recruited participants. Very often they simply surveyed the adults, like, how do you think your kid feels being raised by two moms? Oh, they love it. Awesome. Looks like the kids fare no different, right? Now, there have been a handful of studies that have used supreme methodology, and those show that biology matters, that mothers and fathers matter, that children are harmed when they lose a mother or father, and so outcomes have dropped, right, for the studies that have used proper methodology. So the data is not with them, right? Common sense, social science, and the stories of kids are with us. So if you want to be an expert and be filled with fire in terms of why kids need a mom and dad, Chapter 6 is for you, especially if you want to read the stories of kids who grew up in same-sex headed households and experienced what we term mother hunger and father hunger, right? Children don't just benefit from maternal love and paternal love. They don't just have a right to their mother and father. They also crave being loved by a man and being loved by a woman. And so you can see that expressed through children who have, for example, two moms, who talk about how they fantasize about having a dad, how they gravitate towards their friends' fathers, how they find themselves with really bizarre, unhealthy desires to connect with their male teachers, because it's not something that is socially constructed, right? This is something that children fundamentally need. This is what human children are made for. So that's a really difficult chapter for anybody that wants to believe that love makes a family. You are starving children of something that they fundamentally need. And yes, there are harms and risks to these kids because by definition, every child raised in the home of two moms and two dads is going to be missing out on the security in terms of like safety of having both biological parents in their life. And so let me also say, little side note, lesbians can be incredible mothers and gay men can be incredible fathers. You know, my mother has been in a relationship with another woman for about 35 years. She repartnered with her partner right after my parents divorced. And she's an incredible mother. Like I was telling Shanda before we began recording, almost everything that I do well as a mom, I do just because that's how my mom parented me. She is exceptional, right? Your sexual attractions don't determine whether or not you're a great mom or dad, but your biology has a hell of a lot to do with it. Men don't mother and women don't father, and kids need both.
Well, speaking of the difference between mothers and fathers in the Gender Matters chapter, it was really fascinating because I saw both my husband and myself in that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is so me. And that is so him, like throwing your kid up in the air and you know how fathers do that. And I think you asked, when's the last time you saw a mother throwing her child up in the air? I'm like, I have never done that. She's so right. And it just shows the difference between dads represent the world and mothers represent the home. And that's why the dads push more. And it's so true because we're going through that right now with our teenage boys. I'm more like, be careful when you go out to drive. Oh my gosh, do we need to drive you because it's snowing outside? Whereas my father's like, they'll learn to drive in the snow. They got to learn sometime. Yeah. But you present these, these differences between why they need a mother and a father and the difference between the two. And they're not stereotypes. It is the truth. It is how, and even my husband always says, babe, they need me to be a little bit more difficult or harsh with them because I'm the dad. That's what dads do. They're like realists, whereas you're the nurturer. So you're so right.
Yeah, this is that's what chapter 3 is all about. Is gender is not a social construct. Male and female differences are biologically determined. And so beneficial. I mean, beneficial probably in every institution, right? To have a balance, a gender balance. But if it's absent in the daily life of a child, That's why we said mother's love and father's love are two staples of a child's social emotional diet. Mothers talk to their kids differently, right? They discipline differently. They play differently. Dads emphasize gross motor skills, running, jumping, climbing, digging, lighting things on fire. Moms do more fine motor skills, cutting, chopping, drawing. And I mean, like, you can just look at their body development and see how moms and dads benefit kids differently. And it's not a switch that men can flip on. It is something that only women can do and only men can do. And kids who do not have that, they're not doomed. By no means. It's not that kids are doomed, but it is just the most incredible design to have both halves of humanity represented in the home of children from the day that they're born until the day that they leave. And that whole, like, men represent the world, women represent the home. That was the brainchild of my co-author, Stacy. And so right. She was so right.
Yeah.
Kids get both. They need the safety net of the home, and they need somebody pushing them out into the world so that they know how to navigate the risks and conquer it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I hear your passion too. And I love that you're so passionate about this because you represent the rights of children well, and you get me fired up. And I hope that you're getting my listeners fired up about it too. But what's so odd is, and so sad at the same time, is that the things that you just said are so controversial today. It's like to say that there's distinct differences between a father and a mother. And it's not because they said, okay, I'm a dad, I have to throw my kid in the air right now. It's just that it's an innate trait that God has provided to the family structure that helps that child grow and provides that balance. And when you look at it, you step back and you look at it, it is beautiful. And you think of it, I think of it for my boys, and I think, thank God how blessed they are to have two parents that love each other and are trying to raise them to the best of our abilities, obviously, but within God's design. There's a lot of kids out there who don't have that. I remember doing a podcast episode just on fatherlessness alone about a year and a half ago, and looking up those statistics on what happens to kids when they have a father that's not in their lives. It's great. It's absolutely, it applies to their physical well-being, their emotional well-being, their mental well-being, everything.
Yeah.
And that was just one podcast episode on one little thing, but your book brings everything. I feel like it brings the whole issue of not fatherlessness, but this children's rights without having a biological mother and father. It brings all of it together and makes you face these things that culture just lies to you about and the church doesn't talk about.
Yeah.
Really.
Well, and what it's going to do, hopefully, for everybody is, number one, answer your questions. Because I think a lot of us have had a sense of, I don't know about this, or this doesn't really seem right, but I need to have something more than God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. I mean, like, more than that out there. And so this is going to answer your question. It's a seamless garment, right? And it's not, we don't have to figure out the disparate answers of, well, in this situation, we say this, and in this issue, we do this. No, begin with the child. Begin with what the child needs and what they have a right to. And then you'll have automatic answers to all of these different marriage and family questions. Let me just quickly tell everybody what's in the book, kind of go through chapter by chapter,
Sure.
so that you know what you're getting. The first chapter, we just talk about rights. Why do children have a right to their mother and father? And we talk about why Republicans will not get anything they want unless they can support children's rights to their mom and dad. Like, small government requires big marriage. And Democrats won't get anything that they want unless they get on board the children's rights train, because of what you just said. My Democrat friends are bleeding heart liberals who are so broken over falling academic rates, teen suicide, teen poverty, incarceration rates, teen homelessness. All of those demographics have something in common, and that is they're overpopulated by fatherless kids. So there will be no social justice until you secure justice for the individual child. So chapter 1 is all about rights. Chapter 2, we talk about biology, why biology matters in the parent-child relationship. And there's no, unfortunately for those that want to deny it, there's no statistical case to be made to the contrary. There's no scientific based case to be made to the contrary. Number 3, chapter 3 is why gender matters and just why moms and dads are different. Chapter 4 is about marriage and why marriage is a social justice issue for children. Chapter 5 is about divorce, and we've talked about that a bit. Chapter 6 kind of talks about kids with same-sex parents and how they struggle. Chapter 7 is about sperm and egg donation. And this is something that not a lot of Christians have thought about, but it is something that all of us need to be very clear on because it is always a harm to children. Chapter 8 is about surrogacy, which again can be very confusing, especially for pro-lifers like me, who we love babies, right? Whatever it takes for babies, give us the babies. But surrogacy is not a child-friendly process. Quickly, I'll just tell you, only 7% of kids created for the purpose of surrogacy will be born alive. Most kids are going to die, be thawed, discarded, die in a freezer, be aborted, be determined to be the wrong sex or non-viable and thrown out. Surrogacy is not about babies. Surrogacy is about on-demand designer babies shipped worldwide.
Wow.
Chapter 9 contrasts adoption and reproductive technologies and talks about why, even though adoption involves loss, adoption is still a child-centric institution. And reproductive technologies are a marketplace that in essence buys and sells children. And then finally, chapter 10 is just about our global movement and where we're going and the incredible people that are in it and all of that. So let me tell you the overarching theme to this, which I think may help some of your listeners if they're going, I don't know. When you're talking about children's rights, here's your cheat sheet. Adults need to do hard things, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Children have experienced mother and father loss since the beginning of time. Oftentimes we would have generations of father loss after war, or we used to routinely have mothers die during childbirth. And so tragedy has always robbed children of their mother or father since the beginning of time. But that is not the reason why most kids today are losing their mom or dad. Most kids today are being separated from their mother or father, not because of tragedy, but because of intentionality, because adult desire is being prioritized above their rights and needs. And so the solution is for adults to do hard things so children don't have to. All these different situations that we have talked about, and all the ones we explain in the book, whether it's an adult who experiences same-sex attraction and desperately wants a family, or an infertile couple who is longing for a child, or a career woman who hasn't found Mr. Right and would be an awesome mom, or the couple sitting next to you in church who's struggling in their marriage. Okay, all of those involve adults who have desires, sadnesses, longings, losses that are very, very real and deserve our empathy and compassion. But no amount of adult desire or longing justifies making a kid sacrifice for you.
Right.
And in all of these situations, the adults need to do the hard thing to protect kids. And so this children's rights movement, it makes demands of all of us. There is no adult who gets a pass in the world of them before us. All of us need to conform to the rights of children rather than expecting them to do hard things for us. So I know that there's people out there who are listening, who are single mothers. And it's not because their desire was put above their children's rights. It's because they were the only parent who was willing to do the hard thing. Like, they were the only parent who was willing to act like an adult. And unfortunately, the child's mother or father valued what they wanted above what their children needed. You know, I know situations where there's step families where a stepfather has come in and decided to do the hard thing of seeking to mend the paternal wound left by the biological father. I certainly am surrounded by adoptive parents who are shepherding their children through their loss and seeking to mend their wound. And the adults have done the hard thing in that situation so that they can care for children. So that is the them before us rule is, are you sacrificing for the sake of children, or are you insisting that children sacrifice for you?
That's good. That is good. So if the audience who's listening are like me and they're like, what do we need to do as adults to help the global children's rights movement? What do you suggest that we do?
Okay, number one, you need to be an expert. And that is exactly what the book is designed to do, is not just give you arguments, not just fortify you with studies, but we're going to show you the kids. We're going to tell you their stories. And there's no way to come away and not want to fight for them. But you need good information too, right? So we give you all of the answers to all of the questions, everything that you're going to be thrown at on the internet, and we put it in a very detailed table of contents. So you can go to the table of contents and be like, oh my gosh, abortion had something to do with surrogacy. Where is it? And you can like right there in the table of contents. Or, oh, somebody just said if I don't support gay marriage, it's the exact same thing as supporting bans on interracial marriage. Well, there it is in the table of contents. You will always find very satisfying child-centric answers to these questions. Like I said, like this is the lens through which to view all matters of marriage and family that is consistent, logical, in line not just with common sense, but biology. So become an expert. Once you read the book, you can definitely follow us on social media. But if you want to do more, we actually have a free PDF study guide. I would recommend getting a bunch of your friends together who care about kids or who care about marriage, who are always like, I want to know how to do this and talk about this. We'll send you the free PDF and you guys can work through this together. And I think that's probably one of the best ways for you to make a difference. Obviously, start reading our newsletter so you can keep track of all the different countries that we are advising on this, all of the different states where we are trying to represent children in the courtroom and in the legislature. If you experienced mother or father loss through divorce or abandonment, or because you were conceived through reproductive technologies, or you were raised by an LGBT parent, tell me your story and I'll change the world with it.
Wow.
Send me your story. We do encourage, I verify everybody's identity, but I often encourage people to share their stories anonymously on our website, because I've found that kids, even kids of divorce, feel like they can't be totally honest if they're writing under their own name. And the world, our movement has always had the best research. We've always had common sense. We've always had biology. We've always had the 5 major religions of the world on our side. But we haven't had the stories. And it's stories that change hearts and minds. It's stories that are going to fill you with fire to defend kids. But those stories are very expensive. It costs kids something to say, I desperately wanted a father even though I loved my 2 mothers. And so we try to create a place where they can share their stories with minimal personal harm. So if you experience this and you want to share your story with us, send it to me.
That's awesome. Katy, thank you again so much for coming on today. I've been messaging you and I'll tell you, oh my gosh, your book is so good. And it is. And I love that you said be an expert, because you've done the hard work. You put this whole thing together. All we have to do is find the resources, buy your book, take the notes, and you'll make us an expert. And as long as we know how to engage in these conversations and continue to open our mouths and talk about it and defend the rights of kids, we will make other people aware as well. So please tell us how we can find and follow you, because I follow you on Instagram and I see where you're going and what you're doing and how you're changing the world. And I appreciate it very much. And so let us know how we can do that.
Yeah, our website is thembeforeus.com. I'm on social media at advo_Katy, like advocate, but advo_Katy with a Y, get it? And we are on Instagram and Facebook, and we've got a Them Before Us Twitter. And so we are on all the platforms. The book's available at Amazon if you want to avoid the Amazon beast. It's also at christianbooks.com. If you do purchase the book at Amazon and read it, I would so appreciate a review, just because the activists hate it. And
yeah, I bet.
So unfortunately, Amazon controls 83% of book sales, and messages are stifled without positive reviews. So we would love for you to be part of us. We'd love you to be one of us. That's the whole point of this movement, is us, the adults, putting them before us. And you will join this incredible coalition of adults, Muslim adults, Mormon adults, men who are gay men who fiercely hate the idea that surrogacy, and which they consider the buying and selling of children, promoted in their name, atheists, homeschool moms, children of divorce, parents who experience divorce. I mean, we are like the most ragtag group that honestly is going to drive back some of the greatest like child harming machines on the planet, simply because we are willing to do the hard thing in our own lives and speak these unpopular truths. So if that's your game, we're your people.
That is awesome. I love that you're doing it. We're all speaking hard truths. If you're listening, take her up on this. Please join their team. I'll leave all of the links in the show notes. I'll leave the link to the book in the show notes. And like Katy said, please leave a review. I'm going to have to leave a review. I got to go do that, right, Katy? I have to, because I've been singing your praises. Yeah. So if you have any questions for Katy or myself, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com. You can reach Katy on her website and Instagram. And if you can't get a hold of her for some reason, you can also email me and I'll make sure that she gets the message. But thank you for hanging with us today. This is great information. Go buy Them Before Us. You will not be disappointed, I promise. And it's going to educate you. It's going to equip you. And you're going to be ready for these hard conversations. And I'll catch you on the next one.